Welcome to Regulatory Ramblings. Our podcast today is brought to you by the University of Hong Kong's RegTech Lab, the HKU SCF FinTech Academy, the Asia Global Institute, and HKU edX Professional Certificate in FinTech, with support from the university's Faculty of Law. As with many, my interest in money laundering and terrorist financing peaked on September 11th, 2001. I lost friends that tragic day in New York, and it was almost a quarter of a century ago. Seems like a lifetime ago. Our guest today is David Caruso. He's the founder and managing director of the Dominion Advisory Group, a Virginia-based consulting firm that works with banks around the U.S., Europe, and Asia that face regulatory enforcement actions. He'll be sharing with us his reflections on a nearly 3-decade-long career in the field of anti-money laundering and financial crime compliance more generally. A former special agent with the U.S. Secret Service and a graduate of the George Washington University in D.C., it's not an exaggeration to say that since 1996, David has been at the forefront of shaping the financial crime risk and compliance industry, building AML and sanctions compliance programs at banking and financial institutions across the U.S. and worldwide, overseeing headline-grabbing corruption and money laundering investigations, and building and selling a RegTech software firm have given him an ideal perspective to reflect on just about every major issue and trend occurring in the financial crime compliance space for the past 25 years. To this day, David aids institutions and organizations to help them navigate financial crime risk and compliance modernization. Having worked at global institutions such as JP Morgan, Riggs Bank, Wachovia, Washington Mutual, and HSBC, just to name a few, his more notable achievements include his time at Riggs Bank as its chief compliance and AML officer. In that capacity, he was hired to address some of the bank's program weaknesses cited by the U.S. Treasury Department's Office of the Comptroller of the Currency, or the OCC, as it's more popularly known. While at Riggs, David's team uncovered 2 notorious international corruption schemes involving the government of Equatorial Guinea and the former Chilean dictator, Augusto Pinochet. The team's work led to investigations by the Department of Justice and the U.S. Senate Permanent Subcommittee on Investigations. The cases drew the attention of the media worldwide and justice authorities in the U.S., U.K., Spain, and Chile. The facts uncovered by David at Riggs shook U.S. lawmakers and regulators and kicked off a decade of active regulatory and law enforcement action against banks across the U.S. After Riggs, David founded the Dominion Advisory Group in 2005. From his ringside seat near the nation's capital, he works closely with executive management boards and outside counsel to craft responses and build entire financial crime risk and compliance programs to address regulatory concerns, of which there have been no shortage in recent years. And with that, I'll turn over to the man himself, David. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, AJ. I really appreciate the opportunity to join you.
I mean, you've got an incredible background. Keen to, peek into your mind and, tease out some of those experiences. Whatever you're willing to share. Tell us a little bit about yourself. I mean, where are you from? Where'd you grow up? And, we know a little bit about your background, but yeah, elaborate on that if you care to.
Yeah, sure. I grew up in New Jersey, maybe 40 or 50 miles from New York City during the 1980s, which I consider probably the greatest decade of the last 100 years.
Oh, for sure. And you got to live through it as an adult. So, yeah.
Yeah. So it was, and then I had a real interest in politics and policy. I thought that's what I wanted my career to be. So I fell in love with Washington, D.C., and George Washington University happens to be in the heart of Washington, D.C. So that was thrilling, as an 18-year-old freshman university student living in a dorm room 3 blocks from the White House. And through various experiences in college, one of the things about George Washington universities, a lot of the kids who go there think they have life all figured out when they're 18, 19, 20. And so it's important for people to get internships, and just through sort of these serendipitous happenstance, and I won't go into the detail, I ended up with an internship at the Secret Service, which I had not ever really planned on pursuing. But if you live in Washington, D.C., the Secret Service has this mystique and aura. And that internship turned into a paying job, still as a college student, where I got to actually work at the White House. This was my junior and senior year of college for the Secret Service. And maybe unsurprisingly, from that, I made a lot of friends who were Secret Service agents. I got exposure to, people at the Secret Service who, it was good to get their attention. And they asked if I wanted to become an agent when I graduated college, and I did. And that was 1991. And I returned to New York after being hired, because again, I was from northern New Jersey, and getting out of Washington to start your career is always a good idea. And it was in the Secret Service where many people in the States and internationally probably associate the Secret Service with protecting the President of the United States, which they do. That's a primary mission. But they also have an investigative mission. Back then, the Secret Service was part of the Treasury Department. And in the New York office, I was assigned to the bank fraud squad. And it turns out, although initially being interested in the Secret Service because of that protection work, traveling the world on Air Force One and all that, I actually really took a liking to financial crime investigations. And I don't know if that was completely surprising, but maybe I was surprised by how much I enjoyed it. And so I got exposure to work with a lot of the large global banks based in New York on various fraud schemes, securities fraud, advanced fees frauds. For those, you may remember, AJ, the prime banknote frauds from way back then. And, about 5 years into the work, I began to wonder if it was something I wanted to do the rest of my career. And let me now introduce my Hong Kong connection. During that period of time, those 5 years, I began to investigate some of these worldwide frauds, and it took me to Hong Kong, where that was really a lot of fun as a young agent traveling to Hong Kong to investigate these frauds. I got to meet and spend a lot of time with the Royal Hong Kong Police, a gentleman named Peter Hazelwood. Pete has also been in AML as long as I have, 30 years. Anywho, Pete left the Hong Kong police before, in 96, obviously before the handover. He joined JP Morgan, and it was a phone call from Pete that got me to leave the Secret Service and enter the private sector in 1996, where I joined JP Morgan. Back then, what I did would today be called enhanced due diligence. What I worked in JP Morgan is what was then called Security Services Group. And what we did is we did background research on private banking and investment banking clients. And again, today it would be called EDD. Remember back then, it was before 9/11, there was no PATRIOT Act. The Bank Secrecy Act existed in the U.S. and other money laundering laws. But I would say worldwide, the people that were in that field in the mid-90s, probably 400 or 500 maybe, if that many around the world. And so, that was my segue from government investigations into the private sector, and then sort of my entry point into what later became, AML.
It's, you hit upon several good points. It's true. There is a cadre of former Royal Hong Kong Police alumni who left at a pretty senior level, senior inspectors, assistant commissioner level types, and they ended up in a number of compliance, security, investigative roles at risk management roles at a number of banks, major world banks in Hong Kong and Singapore. And I mean, they're gradually passing through the system. Some of them are still there, But yeah, they that alumni network does very well for itself. And our our listeners should know that the Secret Service handles quite a bit of financial crime, fraud stuff still to this day. I mean, I know that after the reshuffling in 2001, and where they, Patriot Act, and they were placed under they were made a part of the newly formed Homeland Security Department. They still handle counterfeiting. But coming back to, more broadly to your experience, so did you serve in the presidential security detail?
No, I never served in the Secret Service. There is a permanent assignment, and interesting. Usually you do that around your 6th or 7th year. It's called the Presidential Protective Division, or PPD for short. Before that, as an agent, you do a lot of protection work, particularly if you're in New York, because the Secret Service not only protects the president and vice president and their families, but they also protect all visiting heads of state and heads of government. So, for example, the Prime Minister of Great Britain comes to the United States. He gets a full Secret Service detail, as would the King as the head of state. And you could...
reminiscent of that scene in Coming to America.
Right, exactly.
You've got that the whole cavalcade of vehicles in front of and behind the King when James Earl Jones pulls up into Queens.
Yeah, so there's a lot of protection work you do, even when you're, quote, what they call a field agent. And I did I supplemented the presidential travel. There's multiple rings of security around the president. And the inner ring are those people assigned to that permanent division, but the middle and outer rings are a lot of Secret Service agents and local police. And that was fun. And, I got to enjoy, I traveled. I was there during the 1992 campaign. In between that and other travel, I think just in those 5 years, I probably visited 30 of states in the United States in 4 or 5 foreign countries. So yeah, it was a nice mix in that 5 years. But again, I found myself gravitating more towards the financial investigations. And right, you mentioned, Secret Service investigates credit card fraud. And again, I left in 1996, so no one I worked with is still there. But the Secret Service has a big electronics crime division. And so, you see them involved in many of the major international criminal investigations because some of their jurisdiction overlaps with the FBI and other agencies.
Yeah, I always wondered about that. That jurisdictional overlap between them and Treasury and DOJ. I guess you're technically all on the same team, but I suppose turf wars do.
In a way, and it's analogous. And I know we'll talk about this in our time today. The U.S. government with its law enforcement and regulatory agencies, there's so many of them. There's a lot of overlap. It's confusing. And it's largely inefficient, and it creates inefficiencies. It creates bureaucratic battles, people
said that about the formation of Homeland Security. They were saying, no, you enhance the counterterrorism capacities of the FBI. People like, well, what? So what is it? Is it law? When Homeland Security was created, people were like, what is it? It's quasi law enforcement, quasi military. Well, what is it? Its primary mandate is to, mitigate, forestall, prevent acts of terrorism in the homeland. But you currently have other agencies that do that. So why not build those up? That was the arguments that were made at the time, but it was an emotional time, and the act passed.
Yeah. I understand the human reaction to events like 9/11 and the government's desire to want to respond and do something. But now, as you mentioned, it's almost a quarter century later. Maybe it's time to have a rethink and say, okay, is how we're organized, and again, both law enforcement and regulatory agencies. What are the primary missions? What are the risks we're trying to identify, mitigate, maybe eliminate, and what's the best organization structure to do that. And I wouldn't, I'll try to throw in some hyperbole here just for, because somebody, that's how I speak. I wouldn't take seriously anyone who would say, well, the current situation is fine, we should leave it as is. I mean, that's not a serious position in my view.
Well, when you think back, I mean, that there was talk that the SEC and the CFTC would merge, and then 9/11 happened, and that put the kibosh on that. But the CFTC people were skittish because they presumed, okay, all that'll happen is we will be subsumed in the SEC, and ours will be a subordinate place to theirs.
Mm-hmm.
The SEC people weren't interested because they were like, no, it's going to mean less funding. So, because the thinking was, okay, well, you're merging for the sake of generating efficiencies. So that means there are going to be staff cuts. But I mean, I see what you're saying. It is inefficient, but I mean, as I think Reagan said, closest thing to immortality is a federal law.
Yeah, a government program. And that's, that quip has been proven true hundreds of thousands of times before.
So what was it about the allure of AML and financial crime compliance? What sparked your interest? Of all the things you could have done while at the Secret Service, all the paths your career could have gone down, why AML?
Part of it is I do enjoy the private sector. So I enjoy the idea of solving business problems. I enjoy the idea, at least in theory, if you're part of a profit-making organization like a bank or a consulting company, everyone is trying to achieve, a goal. In this case, it would be, to make money and be profitable. One of the observations I have, however, and it's, I observe it, I talk about it as a criticism. I don't think compliance people, the AML included, but all compliance, sometimes they don't remember that they're part of a business organization. And I think sometimes they impose on themselves, oddly enough, this view that they're somehow a second-class citizen within the organizations they work. So part of the allure,
but a part of that isn't part of that they're seeing the obscene. I'm sorry to interject. They're seeing the obscene salaries that the bankers and the traders are making, and you're like, okay, that makes sense. Those guys bring in the business.
Yeah,
you're a cost center. You're the state mandates we have you, but it's you're being paid not in substantial amounts, certainly at the senior levels, for what's essentially an oversight role.
Yeah.
It does the resentment not at least in part stem from that?
It may. However, I suggest quite vocally often that if you are seen as nothing more than a cost center in your organization, you, if you're the leader, are doing a poor job of communicating with executive management about the value you bring. And, there is value in what every compliance person does. Presumably there should be anyway, if they're going to work and putting in an honest day's work. I remember at one point when I can't remember if I was at JP Morgan, and this was in the late 90s, or I also did time at EY and KPMG, when it dawned on me that financial institutions themselves, in the main, are nothing more than risk managers, right? If a bank's core function is lending money, well, you lend money after you do a risk assessment and a risk analysis on the borrower. So they're managing risk. Now, the risk they're managing ends up earning profit for the bank when that corporation or individual who takes that loan pays it back. But everything a financial institution does is identify, understand, dissect, and manage risk. Some of it's a lot of it's financial risk, credit risk, and other risks. And some of it is operational risk, right? What if our facilities are hit by tornadoes, power outage? Then we can't do what the bank does. And a lot of it's compliance and legal risk. So, if you're working for an organization or a financial institution whose CEO doesn't understand that, that's probably not a financial organization that's going to do very well for a long period of time. So financial crime professionals need to reorient many of them, not all of them, but need to reorient the value they provide to the organizations where they work. And they need to think of themselves in the context of, we are part of an organization whose key function is managing risk. We manage one type of risk and other people manage other types of risk. We're just as valuable.
And that's not to say cost centers can add value, because with your tax department, for example, they're not bringing in business, but there's a different appreciation level for tax because you can see how much money they've saved you. So there is that. But I mean, to your point about the different flavors of risk, I mean, as I've always seen it, I've understood it. I mean, you've got the three threads of governance, risk, and compliance. So they're interconnected, they're intertwined. They're not necessarily the same thing, but it's hard to have a comprehensive discussion about any one of those without bringing up and implicating the other two. So my sense of compliance is that it's fundamentally a backward-looking proposition, because it's after the fact. You're trying to figure out who's guilty of malfeasance, who the wrongdoers are, and you're doing the investigation. You're making queries. You're trying to figure out what went wrong, so that it doesn't happen again. You can amend your compliance programs, and you can provide a halfway persuasive explanation to the regulator who's breathing down your neck. Risk management, as I understand and how it's always been taught, is it's a forward-looking proposition. You're trying to envisage problems that come up and steer clear of them. Forecasting, portending trends, patterns, themes that are in the offing. The concern is they're trying to use compliance to do risk management. That's what the older crowd say. Now the younger compliance officers have a more holistic, it's all interconnected, good governance is good risk management is good compliance. And they would say, before I enter a scenario, same setting up a bank branch for an Australian bank in Vietnam, in Ho Chi Minh City, they have many of the same, but somewhat different concerns to the folks in Saigon. So, the folks in Hanoi, I'm sorry. I look at that particular locality, that milieu. I do a risk assessment first. Then, on the basis of that risk assessment, I create a tailored compliance program. Personally, I think they're both right.
Yeah,
I think there's validity in both perspectives, because obviously it's on the basis of a risk assessment. Having done a risk assessment, you know what the problems are, and then you can devise a sound compliance program. But we can hear your thoughts.
Yeah, I don't know if I would challenge the idea that compliance is mostly retrospective. There are compliance investigations, clearly, that when a control either goes awry or a savvy customer has skirted a control, that is well designed, but criminals are often better. They're a little further ahead sometimes. So you are going to invest. You're going to do a retrospective look. You're going to say what went wrong, what could have gone better. But I think that financial crime compliance is largely, I would say largely, as in more than 50%, weighted or focused on future risk. And I think particularly anything that has to do with client, KYC and onboarding. That is at least the way, in theory, you're applying things you've learned. You're designing models, and those could be software models, but they could just also be manual operating models that are looking to identify customers that fit certain or have certain characteristics that are more likely to engage in, troubling activity or activity the bank, financial crime activity that the bank does not want. That's a large component of financial crime compliance now. Now, there is also the monitoring. There's the real time. So there's the prospective. Then there's the real time. We're monitoring. This is more fraud. We're monitoring things in real time that are problematic. We need to detect those, maybe stop those, and if necessary, report them. Where money laundering compliance is admittedly when you get to the non-KYC onboarding, it is, by definition, retrospective, right? We're looking at events and transactions that occurred. Sometimes it's only the day before, but it is after the fact. So AML investigations are after the fact. And I think, that when, when I think back over my 28 years, that was that would be considered AML in the mid to late 90s. We look at stuff after the fact. That's what we do. We're investigators, we're former law enforcement, and we look at stuff after the fact. But I think that's evolved a lot over the last quarter century.
It has evolved because, for the longest time, that this space, right? There was enough truth to the proposition that it almost became a bit of a cliche, but that it was seen as the province, the dumping ground for burnt out lawyers and accountants, and a plum retirement job for ex-military law enforcement intelligence types.
Yeah, that's interesting. I agree with you. And so that has changed entirely. When I first entered this industry in 1996, I went to work at J.P. Morgan in New York City on the 60 Wall Street was the building. And I worked in a group called Security Services. And every person in that group who wasn't an administrative assistant was a retired NYPD detective. That was just who banks hired. And by the way, that was, these guys were, I can't even describe how much fun they were. Right? Imagine I was in my late 20s, or, I was like 27, I think, at the time. And I'm working with a lot of, someone was like a retired homicide detective from the Bronx. The stories they had were just, it was really fun. I'll leave it at that. But I also remember, my colleagues in the Secret Service and my old rivals in the FBI. Like if a bank had a top level position in the fraud or AML department, it was the former agent in charge of the New York office or the former, head of the, DC office. That, I believe, overall has proven was not particularly effective. And you see that rarely today. Rarely do you see senior law enforcement executives transitioning to running AML or even fraud departments at financial institutions. Because over the last 20 years, there's been a professionalization of AML and fraud and bribery and corruption professionals who don't need law enforcement backgrounds. So I would say the law enforcement people in this space are fewer and fewer every year.
Well, in some ways that's great because it opens up profession to people with different backgrounds, but I kind of feel as though we're losing something because you can't buy the kind of experience that these people, and the instincts and the investigative skills that these people have honed, being in the trenches and dealing with the worst that humanity has to offer. But that's,
yeah, I agree, and I think that's a good. I know, AJ, you and I have spoken prior, and I think that's a good segue into this idea that, or this question, is what is the purpose of AML, and are we focused on that purpose, or have we drifted from that purpose? And I believe strongly, it's something I've again stated publicly that I write about, the purpose of anti-money laundering, regardless of what country you're in, regardless of the regulatory regime, is to identify and report suspicious activity, right? It's investigative in nature. I went on a little tangent there about, onboarding and KYC. Those things are important functions. But ultimately, these laws exist to provide law enforcement with tips or, activity reports that say, hey, we've investigated this in our financial institution. We think it's suspicious. So to your point, you need people who are great investigators. And that may not be actually what's going on every day in AML programs around the world because of, the focus of regulators, and just, I think, a drifting away from that original purpose.
So, that's a good segue into my next query, which is, 28 years on.
Yeah.
Broadly, in terms of the themes and trends, the patterns of interaction, the methodologies, the typologies of crime, what about AML has changed and what's remained the same?
Well, that's a great question. So let me sort of think about that from a few different perspectives. One thing that's clearly changed, let's look at it from the sort of rules and regulations perspective. There are so many rules and regulations right now. I guess there's a few people in the world that might know them all, but not.
BBS, Bank Secrecy Act, 1970, PATRIOT Act, 2001, FATCA, which people forget is also an AML statute because it's heavy emphasis on KYC, even though it's more about tax and reporting, and the Anti-Money Laundering Act of 2020. So people have commented, again, it's laws that are being passed upon laws, the regs upon regs, and we started to quote Reagan again, but when he came into office in 1980, his point was, you've got, and at that point you could make a bigger claim. It was more of a Judeo-Christian nation, but he said, you've got 10 million laws to enforce 10 commandments. And again, keep in mind, that was January of 1981 when he took office. It's no doubt gotten worse now.
Yeah, and they can't keep up. Like you mentioned, the Anti-Money Laundering Act of 2020. There are numerous mandates that law requires FinCEN in the U.S. FinCEN is Financial Crime Enforcement Network. They're the overseer of the Bank Secrecy Act and the PATRIOT Act. It's required them to do some number of things. I've lost track, but let's say 10 things just for discussion purposes. And all of those things were due years ago, literally 2 years ago, and they're just not done. So the Congress, and the way our system works, the American people through our representatives have said FinCEN by 2022 we'll do this, by 2023 we'll do this, and they just haven't. And so because they can't keep up. And the idea that, we need more people, we need to make these agencies bigger and hire more rule writers and regulators. Again, I just bristle at that. That's how we solve every problem. So you asked, how has AML changed? That's one way. There's just endless rules and seemingly endless rules and regulations. Some of them are contradictory. When you have so many of these, the application of them becomes haphazard and inconsistent. And then the auditing and examining of institutions to see if they're complying with the rules that are haphazard and inconsistent, now you've got sort of haphazard and inconsistent squared. And what you've had is large banks, banks of all size, but let's just focus on large banks for the moment. Their management, to their AML management team, their focus and devotion is to passing the next audit and passing the next regulatory examination. if you were to say to them, hey, how are you doing identifying and reporting suspicious activity and giving law enforcement the information they need? Their answer would be, well, my goal is to do it well enough so the auditors and regulators think I'm doing they think I'm doing a good job. And I'm not insinuating that the people aren't doing a good job, but it's the goal is to perform these functions so that an examiner can say that it's satisfactory, and that's a victory. That's that, the banks consider it a victory, the AML officer considers it a victory, and I guess the regulators consider it a victory because it's not a bank that they have to cite for failure, which then draws attention on the regulators from policymakers in Congress wanting to know, hey, how come this bank has failed its AML requirements? What are you doing, regulator? How come you're not clamping down harder?
There is that. And I mean, this is cynical, but people who 2 decades ago were arguing about the need for the PATRIOT Act and all the, all these hindrances and obstacles and restrictions that were placed in the financial sector that customers actually have to bear the brunt of and pay, higher charges for to pay for this, all these compliance costs ultimately. They argued vehemently that this was necessary. And some of these same people are now coming around and saying, no, regulatory change or frequent regulatory change is a huge bonanza for law firms, accountants, and consultants. Mm-hmm. Because just when you think you've gotten to grips with, the 1999 rules, out come the 2005 rules, and now you have to deal with that. This constant regulatory rollover, constant regulatory change is driving firms mad, but it keeps a certain segment of the professional classes employed. I mean, especially as long as we live in a world that's regulated from Washington, New York, and London.
Agreed.
So the financial world is regulated from Washington, New York, and London.
Yeah, it's created what I refer to as an industrial complex. I mean, I'm channeling Dwight Eisenhower there when he referred to the military-industrial complex, which is, in essence, what he was saying in 1960 was we've created an infrastructure that it's self-perpetuating, and that's what we have. And this, I believe, is what you're suggesting is what I am saying is this sort of AML industrial complex, right? You've got this churn of rules, regulations, new ones all the time from different bodies across the world, right? Then you have the professional class, of which I'm a part, right? The lawyers, the consultants, and then the people who work in the organizations themselves. And certainly I think that the concept of industrial complex has a cynical tone to it. And I do mean that cynically, because when you have something like that is self-perpetuating, I think it degrades from the original purpose, which is, like many or most original purposes in law, policy, regulation, is laudable, right? We don't want criminals using our financial systems to ply their trade, which often brings death and destruction on citizens of a country through narcotics and other things, and terrorism as well. And we certainly don't want people victimized. We don't want people victimized by the use of the system either. And so when you have this morass of rules, regulations, regulators, consultants, lawyers, practitioners, departments growing from 10 people to 1,000 people, I just think it harms the focus on that original purpose.
In theory, it is laudable. I mean, you talk to Mike Kohler, the famed FCPA the FCPA Quinquit professor. He runs the FCPA blog, and he's pointed out to me on multiple occasions that you had the FCPA, which started out as a decent, well-intended statute. What it's led to is the proliferation of the rather sizable cottage industry that is known as FCPA Inc.
Right.
And that's a problem, and that ties into the whole. And we were talking about how additional requirements and expectations have been created, and that AML teams have lost sight of their primary mission. And so, if we look to the regulators, what do you see as their impact in distracting from the primary mission? Because the critique is they've created so much busy work. When the PATRIOT Act came out, Michael Moscow, the then head of the Chicago Federal Reserve, said at a luncheon in 04-05 that I attended that banks should exercise greater restraint in filing their suspicious activity and suspicious transaction reports. They should articulate their suspicion with greater specificity, and they should cut down on duplicative reports. You look at that from the MLRO's point of view, and they're thinking, okay, if there are consequences, or the compliance point of view, if there are consequences, it's going to be on my head. If they want it, let them have it all up in the floodgates. Yeah. Who cares if it's like aiming a fire hose at a teacup and they can't handle it all, which is what the federal government was complaining about. Let them have it all, and that way I fulfilled my duty to disclose, my duty to report, and the rest is on them.
Yeah. So thinking about, and why is that, right? So back to I think the original question you asked is what's the impact the regulators have? And one of the things I've been able to...
It's just too much busy work that gets in the way of regular compliance, because you look at, the AML guys at a bank, they can't leave until all the transactions for that day are cleared. On a good day, it's early in the evening. On a bad day, it might be late in the evening or in the wee hours of the following morning. Again, they're creating too much busy work, and this is true even of small and medium-sized banks, that the volume of transactions that they have to handle.
So why is that? And one of the interesting things about living in and around the Washington, D.C. area for all of most of my adult life, and I mentioned at the beginning, I've always had this sort of interest in politics and policy, is seeing regulatory agencies exist so that they can continue to exist. What do I mean by that? There's nothing the head of a regulatory agency wants less than to be hauled before Congress and asked or grilled as to why such and such a bank has failed. Why is this bank in the headlines for laundering money? What are you doing? What is your agency doing? Because think about Congress, whether it's the House or Senate, they can haul in the bank CEOs, and no bank CEO wants to sit there and listen to some congressperson dress them down for having a bank that launders money. But in the end, there isn't too much direct power that those Congress people have over the banks, but they do have a lot of power over the regulatory agencies. And in Washington, and remember, this is government. The motivation is to get power and keep it. And that goes for regulators as well. We're all human beings. This is human nature. If you're working in government, it's about accumulating power and keeping it. So the head of the controller of the currency, the head of supervision at the Fed, the head of the FDIC, they do not want to be in front of Congress explaining why a bank they supervise has failed in AML. So that trickles down to the next layer of management, to the next layer of management, to the field examiners. We cannot have a bank on our watch fall on its face and become a headline story in the Washington Post and around there, Wall Street Journal, that they're laundering money for the Mexican drug cartel. So what is a remedy for that? File away, right? Because they can say the control of the currency can say to some angry senator, we have instructed these banks to file SARs, right? That's what we test for. And so the bank's going to overfile, the regulators are going to be fine with it, and the game goes on, day in and day out. Because it's, for the regulators, it's about protecting power, their status, their position. For banks, it's about, not getting in the crosshairs of an angry regulator who wants to argue with you about why you didn't file a SAR, when the examiner is going to say, and I've been in many meetings where examiners say, what's the big deal? Just file. It when in doubt, file. And the bank says, okay, that's what we'll do. So, and I just, AJ, that's not going to stop, right? Congress is not, no member of Congress is going to say, wow, that's a great point. Next time there's a bank failure, we shouldn't go so hard on the regulators.
I don't think the gravity of what someone from the OCC, if they were to say that in a congressional hearing, I don't think the gravity of that statement would fully sink in. But, if we were to turn to the MLROs who are on the front lines, I mean, what do you think the regulatory exam focused mindset of MLROs, I mean, how does that impact operations and innovation? Because look, the perpetual lament in the profession is it's turned into a perfunctory exercise in box checking, and that's that. And once all the right pieces of paper are filed in the right manner, and it's overly formalistic. Form over function. Once that's done, they feel they fulfilled their obligation, their duty. We know it goes deeper than that, but that is how the profession still operates.
It is. And I think that is probably the biggest impediment to innovation. So let me talk a little bit more about that. So that
is technology the solution?
I don't know. I mean, it's part of a better solution. I mean, better technology is something that's happened, since the discovery of fire, right? So there's always better technology. Some of the technologies work, some don't. The market figures that out. The ones that work survive and help whatever they're meant to do, whatever they're meant to help, they help. However, what is very difficult in AML today is that because of the sort of regulatory, because of the MLROs are focused on passing regulatory exams. Passing regulatory exams usually means, particularly if you have a program run well. And most AML programs around the world are run well, right? I think, at least in the U.S., regulators say that the number of banks that they put under consent orders every year is always around like 1 or 2% of the banks they examine. So that's a low number. So that means, 98% of the banks are running the program well. Well, if you're running the program well last year, why change it, right? Why introduce something new, a new technology, a new software that is going to disrupt in some way? It could disrupt your business as usual operations. It could distract focus of people away from their current job to to implementing something new. So what that means is, so there you just have the risk of change when you have the regulators publicly stating, and I mean, I was at an event several weeks ago where, the regulators from the 4 U.S. agencies were on stage, and they told the audience to please move slowly. I couldn't believe it. It was, if you're going to implement change, really think through it, make sure it's the right thing, and there's no harm in moving slowly. So they have a regulator on stage saying that to hundreds of AML workers. And so that is a major impediment to technology change, because technology introduces a level of risk that MLROs, if they're sensible, just say it's not worth it. And you mentioned, several times, AJ, that there's a lot of this work that's sort of like busy work, checking boxes. And if you ask the MLROs, what do they think about that? They say, well, it's what it is. And I have the people to do that. Those people have been on my staff for 10 years. The cost is already built in. So I'm not getting pressure from the CFO to cut my costs. My department doesn't really grow much year over year. And so what's my motivation? Why would I go to the CFO? Why would I go to the CEO and say, hey, I would like a 7-figure budget to run some proofs of concept and test this new technology that, by the way, may not work.
Yet the common refrain we hear at events is, no, compliance budgets need to grow. We need to grow because we need to be able to recruit and retain quality talent. Is there any truth to that, or are these just people, buttering their own bread? And
yeah, I mean, back to human nature. Many MLROs, they all think they need a bigger budget. Who in the bank doesn't think they need a bigger budget? All right, every department needs a bigger budget. So, that I just sort of sit in the back of the room and smirk when I hear that. It's the same folks who say, "Oh, we're facing bad economic times. Bank earnings are going down, but you can't cut the compliance department." I mean, I don't want anyone to lose their job, but it
is so shamelessly self-serving that
yeah. So what are you gonna? You're gonna have a bank that has no earnings, but we're gonna have a really big compliance department. Like, that bank's not going to survive. So none of those people in compliance will have a job.
Right. Everyone talks about zero compliance.
Yeah.
And it's so hackneyed by this point. Yes, it makes for good sound bites. It makes for good headlines when public officials say it. But zero compliance realistically would mean no business. And I think that's something that the people who've got their, heads on right understand. Compliance cannot be carried on to the nth degree.
Right.
That there is a point of diminishing returns, and there's a certain optimal level beyond which it may not make sense to employ that level of scrutiny past a certain point.
Yeah. Well, particularly in tough economic times, and if the organizations you're working for aren't profitable, it's the tough decisions are going to have to be made. Again, I don't want anyone who does an honest day's work, I don't want them to ever lose their job. But unfortunately, the market forces are just what the market forces are.
Now, that's a good transition to the next question I have for you, which was, no one seems to ask if new rules and regs are working or whether they actually prevent crime, or they have the unintended consequence of reducing growth. I mean, certainly amongst a lot of the bankers and traders, they're saying, who are these people who are making, again, not insubstantial amounts for what is essentially an oversight role?
Yeah, and that's a shame. 25 years on, we have no idea what works and what doesn't. What do you measure? How do you measure? Experienced, skilled people have a sense for what works. They have endless anecdotes for what works. And many of those, or maybe all of them, can be true and accurate. However, something I've spoken about recently particularly in, with these new AML rules coming out, is what's the measure? What's the basic, simple measure for success in AML? Let's start with the fact that we have no idea. There isn't a reliable figure for how much money is laundered around the world. Now, I'm not saying that's an easy thing to figure out. It's beyond my statistical and mathematical capabilities. But there are smart people who could figure it out. You could certainly figure it out maybe at a national scale. Maybe that doesn't have to be a global scale. And so we have to start with the baseline, right? I think about, and so if we have a baseline, then we can, as we introduce new rules, we can measure that baseline. Say, well, is it, are we reducing the amount of this bad thing, or at least are we retarding its growth? Right? We know that crime grows 5% a year, unchecked, but we're keeping the growth 2%. Whatever it would be, we have no idea about any of that. And I think about it, it's like someone saying, I'm going to go on a weight loss program, but I'm never going to weigh myself. Right? Or I want to lose 15 pounds, or I want to get in better shape, but I'm not going to, I want to get stronger, and I'm going to get stronger by increasing how much weight I lift. Well, that means on day one, you have to measure how much weight can I lift on day one. Oh, I can lift 400 pounds. Well, okay, 200 pounds. And if I exercise every day for 6 months, I'm going to retest myself, and holy cow, I can lift 250 pounds. I improved 50 pounds on my lifting. There's nothing like that in our industry. And there doesn't seem to be like an interest in it.
You sure about that? Because you almost make it sound as though the industry is more art than science, that it almost eschews empirical data, whereas, because to your point about baselines, that could be a dangerous thing, because the government will say, okay, fine, if this is the baseline, if we expect this much is being laundered, this is the size of the black economy, I expect you to meet your quota and haul in this much each quarter, each year, and then that might, in fines and recoveries, and that might lead to over-aggressive policing and enforcement.
Yeah, I understand. And we've seen some of that, particularly in our discussion isn't about asset forfeiture rules and laws, but that certainly happened in the U.S., where you put in a program in place to incentivize asset forfeiture, and the next thing you know, every single law enforcement case is about seizing Corvettes and cash. So yeah, these are complicated things, and but what I'm saying is, just because they're complicated doesn't mean we shouldn't be thinking about them. And again, we're 25 years into this, so over that period of time, there could have been things that were measured. Another example, I think about a massive part of this industry is risk rating customers at the time of account opening, and then, maybe periodically afterwards. I've asked the question to many people, and I never get an answer. I usually just get a laugh, where I say to someone who runs a large program at a bank, you have a customer risk rating process, a methodology. And the purpose of that is to rate customers, let's say high, medium, and low risk. And the customers who are high risk are subjected to enhanced monitoring, enhanced due diligence research. And the premise is that because of either who they are or the type of business they're in, they're more likely to engage in suspicious activity. The question I ask is, well, have you ever done an analysis on that? Have you ever said, these are our high-risk customers? Do they, in fact, end up, is it more likely that SARS will be filed on these customers? And the answer is no. I hear the answer anecdotally. People whisper it to me. Oh yeah, no. They're high risk because they own a gas station, but they don't actually. Their account activity is benign. It's gas station activity. So we have this entire exercise, and so my proposition is that's what FinCEN should be doing. FinCEN should be studying, they should pick one question a year, along with the banks, have a committee of some sort. And again, there's a lot of details that have to be worked out, but it's possible. And say, we're going to study this question. Does customer risk rating have any value? Does it actually identify people more likely to engage in suspicious activity? And if the answer is yes, then FinCEN could say, we've studied this issue, we have data supporting it, and we have best practices. And here it is. Here are the best practices. Here is the data. And if the answer is no, it doesn't, then guess what? Maybe that's a rule that gets changed. None of that's ever done.
Yeah, people need to have a better sense of unintended consequences. Look, the regulators have been saying to banks for years now, you need to take a risk-based approach. They're doing wholesale de-risking, unbanking, saying, no, we deem you to be a business in a high-risk category. We don't want to deal with you because, say, you're the jewelry business. And, so what does that do? That if you deny such people banking services, God forbid you should have them turn to the shadow banking system. Because again, what is money laundering other than the transfer of value? Water finds the path of least resistance. And there are options for these people outside of mainstream banking. They need banking services. They don't necessarily need banks. That undermines what regulators and policymakers are trying to do. But again, people don't see that when the complexities of implementation at street level are not often envisioned when these rules are drafted.
Yeah, I mean, there's a general lack of thinking through second and third order effects. I remember it was 2004. I was at Riggs Bank, and in the U.S., the issue of money service businesses arose. For those international listeners who don't know what an MSB is, I think they're just a Western Union, right? They're money remit. Among things they do, they remit money cross border. They might sell like a cashier's check or other sort of financial instruments. Well, these were deemed high risk back in 2004, and every bank that had MSBs and by this and up to this point, MSBs were just customers, right? But all of a sudden, it became question number one to every MLRO in the U.S. How many MSBs do you have? What are you doing to monitor them? And many banks, including Riggs Bank, we had a lot of other issues at the time. We just said, we don't need this additional headache. Close these accounts. Get rid of them. Like, sorry, we're closing them. And so did a lot of other banks. And I just, even back then, I thought, do the regulators not understand that's what happens? Now, again, to think back to what I said a few moments ago about regulators. My view is those regulatory agencies who oversaw us said, cool, that's good with us because it's not our problem anymore. Yeah, the OCC might laugh and say, well, now it's the FDIC's problem. Or the FDIC might laugh and go, wow, now it's the Fed's problem, because in the U.S., all these banks are regulated by different regulators. So it's like, you're just getting rid of one high-risk customer. You're not getting rid of them. You're transferring the risk to your rival regulatory agency and having a good chuckle about it, probably, until one day it comes back to bite you because, karma always returns the favor. So yeah, same thing's happening now with whatever the latest sort of high-risk group is. All right, banish them from banking. That'll solve the problem.
We recently had Dr. Mariola Merzouk on the program, and she's a co-founder of Vortex Risk in London. And to our listeners, in case you're wondering, it was episode 48, if you'd like to go back and listen. But, we discussed that, again, that the financial world is all too often regulated from Washington and New York and London and increasingly Brussels. And yet, while the US and the UK have, and again, the EU is showing more of its teeth in recent years, But while they have some of the most aggressive jurisdictions, there's some of the most aggressive jurisdictions when it comes to financial crime enforcement actions. The regulatory apparatus is often used to further around geopolitical goals. And Dr. Marzouk's point of view is that many outside the West believe that, and it's a perspective that's not without merit. So with that as our preface, why is there so much geopolitical hypocrisy when it comes to AML and financial crime compliance, as well as when it comes to, fighting bribery, fraud, and corruption internationally? That when you look back to how Delta Asia in 2005, it claims the Koreans using Macau banks, the mere threat to use Section 312 against Delta Asia, they wouldn't have been able to use U.S. dollars, effectively cutting them off from the international banking system. The mere threat was enough to ensure compliance. And of course, I don't know if it was actually proven, but I think and I don't know why they were zeroing in on Stanley Au and his bank Delta Asia, but the bigger point was that all the banks in Macau had compliance deficiencies. So again, why is there so much hypocrisy in the space? Or is this just lawfare that it's an extension of political games of war by other means?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, if we didn't have hypocrisy, we wouldn't have government. So, yeah, I mean, the U.S. government. Let's just focus on. I live in the U.S. I'm very familiar with the U.S. government. The U.S. government has multiple different objectives at any one time on the same topic, and you've got a State Department that's hostile to India, and a Defense Department that wants to work with it. Exactly, and right, and then you could have a Treasury Department, and you have a Commerce Department who's making trips to these countries trying to increase trade. Then you got then you have a Treasury Department who's trying to sanction some of those same entities, not the same entities, but related entities or related industries in either that country or that region of the world. Again, because when you have these massive organizations known as departments in the government, they're all motivated to increase and maintain their influence and power. And they will vie against one another. And sometimes, sometimes they'll have the same mission and they'll just be competing with one another, right? The State Department and the Defense Department might have similar missions, but each one wants more U.S. tax dollars for their budget. Each one wants a greater presence in whatever foreign country they're trying to operate and influence. I do think, though, in the last few years, some of the hypocrisy around government decisions in their contradictory nature is it's sort of like a level 10. I'll wade into some treacherous territory here. I mean, I can't listen anymore to events, AML events in the U.S. where people on stage from the industry and the government are talking about the scourge of human trafficking. And again, I don't need to get too deep into politics, but all anybody needs to do is look at the U.S. border situation right now and think, okay, so human trafficking is actually one of the FinCEN's stated priorities. Meanwhile, the cartels are running the largest human trafficking operations in the history of the world, right in front of us. And it seems to be permitted. I can't sit in those sessions at seminar in conferences because I just want to stand up and scream. And
the platitudes and the full sense of rectitude, that the repetition of canards, it's just so much hackneyed verbiage that it just, they're going through the motions, they're saying what needs to be said, because realistically, where is the fire in the middle? Where is the domestic tolerance for, say, putting U.S. forces in Mexico, which may well be what's required?
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I guess if someone tries it, we'll understand. We'll find out what the domestic tolerance is. But, at least, without having to go that far, at least, I think as we're both suggesting, bring some consistency, right, to the policies. Don't actually have policies that undermine each other. Don't say things like human trafficking and drug smuggling are two of FinCEN's 8 priorities, and financial institutions better update their programs to include systems to detect and report this activity. Oh, and by the way, we're going to let the Mexican cartels, sort of do as they please as far as human trafficking and drug trafficking go. Yeah, it's frustrating. And it does, I think it makes a lot of people in this space, some people in this space, wonder, like, what are we doing?
Well, I mean, Peter Zeihan, the noted political geostrategist, has said that when it comes to that gang violence, the minute it starts encroaching into the U.S., which it has, but the minute you start seeing blonde women, blonde, blue-eyed old American girls named Sue Ellen or Mary Jane getting caught up in some of that violence and activity, then perhaps the American public will have a change in attitude and say, okay, maybe we need to be a bit more forceful. But I'd like to turn to the topic of sanctions, because sanctions against Russia don't seem to have been all that effective. And is there a lesson in here that it reaches a point of diminishing returns when that maybe sanctions aren't all that effective against someone who's a large player in the international system? They're self-sufficient when it comes to energy and foodstuffs. They're a key exporter of energy and foodstuffs and the inputs that many countries need to grow their own food. Is there something to be said for that? That sanctions aren't going to have the desired effect? Not to say that they shouldn't be done, but because the message needs to be sent, but that some countries can function just fine as pariahs.
Yeah, I think you said something in there that hit on it, which is, I think sometimes sanctions are really more of a political statement than an economic hindrance. So I would agree. I think any objective person, but I'm open to argument otherwise, that sanctions against Russia have not had that big of an impact on Russia. Again, I'm sure someone could say, oh, it has this impact here, this impact there. But a country that has the natural resources Russia has, that has the military power it has, that has the internal manufacturing capability, and has alliances with half the world who agrees with, or at least sides with them, economic sanctions are going to have little, if any, impact. Now, again, does that mean we don't do them? Maybe, maybe not. But maybe it's better to say we're doing this as a means to emphasize our, disagreement, or whatever stronger adjective you want to use for what they're doing.
Well, kind of like when it comes to the financial world, when it comes to manufacturing for China or financial space from the U.S. Sometimes certain countries are just too big of a player. You can't avoid them completely.
No, you certainly can't. I mean, and again, I do think this has, but even look at the smaller countries. And I've I read something a few years ago. It was very sarcastic. Well, it wasn't sarcastic. It was very anti-sanction. But and again, it was hyperbole. But the point was got across, which was, if sanctions work, why are we all not taking wonderful vacations in that beautiful Caribbean democracy known as Cuba? Or why are we not visiting, the bustling, growing economy of North Korea? I mean, these are countries that have been under sanctions for decades, and they remain.
Right, Trump wanted to put resorts on the beaches in North Korea.
Yeah, I mean, that was a interesting persuasion tactic to say, look, if you can join the world, look at what you could have. And maybe that was more the carrot, because arguably, if the purpose of the stick was to make sure North Korea didn't get nuclear weapons, well, it didn't work. They have nuclear weapons. If the purpose of sanctions against Cuba was to rid it of its communist, socialist government and replace it with something more democracy-like, well, that hasn't happened either. And that was, 1960, 61. Now, again, I also don't like the idea, Cuba is a repressive regime. They jail dissidents. They treat their own citizens poorly. There's a lot of poverty. So just to say, hey, everything's cool, we're just going to normalize things with Cuba. I don't know if that's the answer either. I don't know, I'm not a Cuba expert in any way.
But the exiles are still the biggest impediment, because there are still a lot of people who are irate that when Batista was overthrown, and I'm not saying Batista's regime was any good either, but when Batista was overthrown, their families lost their positions in society. They lost their money, their prominence, their properties. And a good number of these Cuban exiles want reparations. I don't know if they're going to get what they're expecting.
Yeah. And they are a powerful voting bloc in Florida. And it's hard to win the White House without winning Florida. You can, it's just hard.
Yeah, the Bay of Pigs turned an entire bloc, for multiple generations. It turned them into Republicans, and I don't think the Democrats ever recovered their goodwill with that community. But then we come to, if we take a step back and all that you've seen, how the profession has changed, how the world has changed over the course of your lifetime, your career, broadly speaking, if a revamp was in the works when it comes to financial crime compliance and you had input into some of those policy recommendations, what would you suggest?
In a real sort of magic wand scenario, I would figure out how to change, and this is in the U.S., but I think maybe a similar model could be rolled out around the world. I would house regulatory authority with one agency. It would be FinCEN. FinCEN would become, and this would be part of a larger realignment of the U.S. sort of law enforcement and regulatory departments. FinCEN would become the financial crime investigative agency. So it would certainly grow significantly. You would shuffle people away. You would take people in the FBI, Secret Service who do financial crime, and they would just become agents of FinCEN or analysts. And because if you had the financial crime agencies whose focus was to detect and deter financial crime, if you had that same agency also executing the regulatory function over banks, you would have at least in theory, you would have an alignment between the regulatory requirements and the purpose of all of these laws. So imagine if FinCEN had a team of examiners, and FinCEN was also the financial crime law enforcement agency. Nothing's perfect, and I'm sure lots of holes could be poked in that. But I think that would be a better, and you would take it away from the OCC, the Fed, and the FDIC. They wouldn't have that authority over bank. They have their other authorities. I don't think if you don't change the government org structure, AJ, I don't think anything, more rules, regulations, fewer rules, regulations won't have as big of an impact.
It would certainly simplify and streamline things. In the time we've got left, this is a growing field, and no doubt, we have our own compliance LLM, the first of its kind in Asia, at HKU Law. I just want to plug that. More people are going into this profession. What advice would you have for young people, students at HKU Law or any other institution that want to go into this field? What's the ideal path to prepare themselves for it? What should they know? What should they study? Are there any technical skills that they should get along the way? Crypto and reg tech and fintech are increasingly becoming part of the equation. How's the best way for them to prepare?
Yeah, that's a great question, and I'll sort of reminisce a little bit.
We both remember the analog world, right? So
yeah, and I was really lucky. It's a cliche to say, life is about timing. But as I mentioned at the beginning of our conversation, when I entered this world in 1996, there were, 400 or 500 people in the world that did what we would now consider AML. And so I got a chance, and then for the next decade, really, I got a chance to do sort of quote, everything in AML. And so I think about AML in particular.
Because it wasn't a specialist then, right?
Yeah, it wasn't. You had to So I divide, and I'm not saying this is the right way, the only way. I think about AML basically as there's two core functions. There's the governance side, and there's the operations side. The governance side would include things like policy, procedure, risk assessment, maybe even technology, strategy. The operations side is the monitoring, the investigations, the filing of the SARs. Back when I started,
the day-to-day grunt work, drudgery.
Yeah, I did. When I started, I didn't think about it that way because you did everything, so you got broad experience. That unfortunately, I think, is unlikely to ever happen again, unless you work at a very, very small financial institution where it's just you. But that also isn't really going to give you the breadth of experience that you want either, because that means it's a very small financial institution. The risk is probably pretty low, so you're not going to get that experience, and certainly you don't have a lot of career growth potential. So for young people, I would encourage a mix of, understanding, getting exposure to those governance functions, preferably things like risk assessments, to really understand risk. You do have to understand technology. That doesn't mean everyone has to learn to code. In fact, very few people need that. But you need to understand how technology works in financial institutions. And what I mean by that is, technology systems are dependent upon data. And so how does an AML system interact with the broader information systems of the bank? Because you don't operate alone. So you should understand systems architecture, again, just at a strategic level. And then, I'm biased. My background is investigations. I do believe strongly that the purpose of this is to identify, investigate, report suspicious activity. I think I'm uncomfortable with MLROs who hold that title, and they've never been investigators. Not everyone who runs an operation needs to know everything about every part of the operation, right? But I do think that MLROs that do not have experience investigating cases, preparing suspicious activity or suspicious transaction reports, there's a gap in their experience that can be problematic. So I do think that now, and if this is something you want to be a career for 30 years, I would spend the first 10 years trying to divide my time between that governance function and operations function. And you got to learn how to manage people. There's just other skills and experiences that, business and human interaction that you need to learn.
Oh, for sure. I remember some years ago, a big, colossal, multinational investigative firm sent someone, and again, this guy had in terms of going back to what you're saying about knowing how to manage people, you've got to manage the right skill sets on a team and have the right skills on the team, and manage particular temperaments. This guy had the right skill set. He had the completely wrong temperament,
right,
to deal with the Japanese. He was an Australian, bull in the China shop type approach, shoot from the hip. But that really didn't work well with them, at least at that time. And it was amazing they managed to salvage the deal. I mean, his point was the client, no, you don't tell me what to do. I'll tell you what to do. I'm the expert. And I'm surprised they didn't. Well, they ended up firing the guy because he ultimately ended up having one of the secretaries in New York burst into tears. And this woman had been with the company for over 30 years. You do not do that. Okay, this was 2001 in New York. Even then, he was just not done. They let him go, but it was surprising he had the career that he did for as long as he did.
Yeah,
with that bombastic temperament. And again, going back to what you're saying about you've got to know how to manage people. You what talents to deploy when and where. A guy like that should not be doing client interface.
No, certainly. And think back to many things we've said. One of the main points of this conversation we've had is that ultimately this is about regulatory relationships. And if you're not a strong communicator and a confident communicator, you're going to have a challenge interacting with auditors and regulators. Not all of those interactions are confrontational by any stretch. In fact, if you're a really good communicator, those conversations should be collegial. Those should be collaborative.
But American regulators have found, certainly with the French, I'm sorry to play into stereotypes, but when French banks ended up, in malfeasance in not a good state, and they had to have these awkward conversations with regulators from other jurisdictions, they came down harder on them because the attitude was with the French. They're like, no, we haven't done anything wrong. It was rather than be contrite, they were defiant. They were like, we want to fight. And okay, well, that's what you get.
Consultants love that. They love a management team that wants to take on the regulators because that's.
So in the time we got left, I mean, is there anything you feel we didn't cover? Anything we didn't discuss? Any final thoughts you'd like to leave our audience with?
No, I think, I know there's probably a lot of people in this space who wonder about the impact of technology. Will it dramatically change AML? I mean, it may, but it will be slowly over time. I don't think there's any, again, thinking back to what we've said, regulators don't like sudden change. Compliance people are, programmed not to want sudden change. So change will happen incrementally. And 5 years from now, you might look back and say, wow, that was a lot of change, but there's not going to be any one moment where where there's this dramatic shift because of some revolutionary technology that's going to come around. I do think the technology will end up changing a lot of the jobs that do a lot of the rote, repetitive sort of information gathering features or aspects. A lot of that work is done in low-cost offshore centers, pulling data from here, querying this, Googling that, cutting and pasting this and that. That work will probably, there'll be less of that work. But I don't think it's any sudden change. But I think overall, 5 years from now, there probably will be the same number or more people in financial crime. But I think there'll be fewer people doing that rote, repetitive, and frankly, very draining work, and more people doing, more complicated or complex investigations and dealing with more rules and regulations.
And perhaps that's as it should be. Let's leave it there. And David Caruso, thank you so much for your time.
AJ, thank you. I enjoyed it.
And to our listeners, thank you. Until next time.